I'm excited.
I'm sure you are.
I am. We get to talk about fandom today.
Another reason why we're talking about Supernatural. Why am I not surprised?
But look at how many episodes we're in, and we haven't actually done a deep dive. And it's not even a deep dive into the show so much as it is the fact that I'm a big fan, and I'm not only a big fan of Supernatural, right? Like I fangirl hard.
No, you go ham for sure.
I do, but the nice part is that it's actually healthy for you. So all of you guys can suck it. Okay, because that is what is going to happen. I'm just really excited about it, and I've always been a big fan, and it's one of the things that when I describe myself is I love with my full heart, and so if I love something, I'm going to love that for the rest of my life. Like I still love Hanson, and I will say that, and I know between you and Ron rolling your eyes right now, like as a huge '90s boy band girl, like I'm Team Backstreet Boys, in case anybody was wondering. Uh, but like I will still love these things, and I know that I will love them into my 40s, 50s, 60s until I am gone. I'm going to love what I love, and that's just the end of it. So I'm excited about that.
All I'm hearing is that I'm going to be basically putting that life-size cutout of Dean Winchester that I got you for your birthday into the coffin with you. That's all I'm hearing.
If it's still around, if it's still like, functional, sure, why not? I mean, he makes it into videos, but it isn't just that part of it, right? Like when I like things, it's just something that I have, and I know you don't really do fandoms, you don't do like sports teams. Matt's kind of the same way. It's like I don't understand what it is that you guys get out of this. And luckily, I don't have to explain it all by myself. I'm super excited about that. So today, joining us for this conversation on the positive and healthy aspects of being a fan or a super fan is Dr. Lynn Zubernis. She has a PhD in clinical developmental psychology from Bryn Mawr College. She's a licensed psychologist and a professor at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. She researches and writes about fandom and all the ways in which a fan is a positive and let me say that again. She researches and writes about fandom and all the ways in which being a fan is a positive and healthy. I'm just reading that wrong. She researches and writes about fandom and all the ways in which being a fan is positive and healthy, helping us discover who we really are and find a sense of belonging and community. Lynn is a proud fan of the recently concluded television show Supernatural. Yes, she's also known as Fangasm in the fandom, in case you guys didn't know. And she has written multiple books on the SPN family fans and yeah, I mean, she's amazing. She's incredible. I've met her at several conventions over the years. Lynn, I'm so excited to have you and to share space with you to talk about the positive aspects of fandom.
I am so excited to be here. I love what you just had to say about fandom and why you're passionate about it, because I am equally passionate about it and equally passionate about the fact that it is a really positive and healthy thing for a lot of people, which is sometimes in contrast to some of the stereotypes that we hear about fandom.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned the stereotypes. Like, let's start there because it feels like there's so many negative aspects that are out there, and I'm just not even sure where they came from. Can you talk a little bit about what we see out there as to what the fans is, and then we can contrast that to what we actually know?
I mean, I think part of the reason there are stereotypes is just people not understanding something. So there's stereotypes about fans because people who are not fans don't really understand the passion of people who are fans. Melissa is like
I'm
shaking
shaking
her
my
head
head.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, I really don't get it. And I think when we don't understand something, sometimes we tend to develop, not Melissa, but sometimes we tend to develop negative beliefs about that, and stigma grows up around that just because we don't understand. So I think that's part of where the original sort of negative stereotypes came in. But unfortunately, my own field did not really help. Some of the early research in fandom from psychology was pretty pathologizing, actually. It kind of looked at extreme fandom. Maybe we'd call it extreme standom now. And by looking at only the extremes, they kind of came away with a skewed view, looking at fans as almost delusional, people who believed that they were in these kind of one-way relationships with the object of their affection and what they called erotomanic delusions. I don't know about you, you're in fandom also. I have not met many people who think that they are in a relationship with Jensen Ackles or Dean Winchester.
I mean, we might dream about it. Like
Sure.
they might make some appearances, guest appearances in our fantasies, but that's about it. Like we're not in an actual relationship. I get that.
Exactly. And fantasy is completely healthy and normative and something that's good for people. So as long as nobody's delusional about it, that's not a problem at all.
So knowing that that's where it started and you went into the field of psychology, you didn't go in thinking you were going to study fans, right? Like that emerged because of your own fandom tendencies, if you will. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I became a psychologist before I became a fan. And when I became a fan, I had been kind of fans of things before. I loved the X-Files, I loved Buffy, but I never was a participatory fan. So I was never part of a fandom. So I didn't really understand the way fandom was and how influential it could be. So when I fell in love with Supernatural and was so passionate about it that I just had to seek out like-minded people, and I had to find the fan fiction, and I had to find where all the fan art was. And then I really discovered what fandom was about, and it became a much more all-encompassing thing. And I immediately, in my psychologist brain, said, "Oh my God, is this okay? Like, here I am, I'm a grown woman, I'm a mom, I'm a partner, I'm a psychologist. Like, I'm like crazy about this TV show. Is there something wrong with me?" And I really didn't know. It's not something that as a clinical psychologist I studied in my graduate training. I honestly had to go start doing the research myself. And then, of course, found all this sort of early pathologizing research and had a few moments of, uh-oh, nope, not okay. No, oh no, what's happening here? Then pushed through that, started doing my own research, started talking to a lot of other fans, and really started understanding that that early research wasn't really getting it right.
Coming from a person that doesn't understand or participate in fandom. I mean, like Cydia mentioned maybe before we started recording, I like things, but they're very fleeting. So, what is it about a sports team, band, or TV show that just invites people to just jump all in?
It has to be something, it's very idiosyncratic, it's very individual, right? There has to be something about that property, whether it's media or whether it's sports or whatever it is, that fulfills some kind of a need in you. There's something about that that pulls you in. It could be that you are really identifying with a character. So, in your own identity development, which is ongoing for our entire lives, maybe there's something in that character that speaks to you in terms of your own identity development and figuring out who you are, or who is an inspiration to you in some way. Maybe it's more about the community. Maybe you want that communal experience of belonging to a group that all cares about this same sports team, and you can all paint yourself green and stand in the parking lot before an Eagles game and tailgate. And it's that part, the communal thing. So it could be all kinds of different things, and different things speak to people and draw them in at different points of their lives, depending on what they're needing at that point in their life. And some people never get drawn in. That's not something that's going to satisfy a need for them. It's not the way they do their own identity exploration. They have another way of doing that.
That's really interesting that, it would come at different times in different forms for everybody, right? Because we are all individuals and we'll have different interests. I'm curious though, is there anything out there that says like, 30% of the population are going to be in fans and other people aren't, or if there's anything like that, any kind of statistics on
You
it?
know, I have never actually read any statistics like that. Just from my own, this is not scientific. I have never done sort of a quantitative large scale research project to try to find how many people identify as fans. It may be out there somewhere, but it seems like probably about a third of people identify as fans of something. It's a pretty significant amount of people, but it's also sort of a wide continuum. So you can be a very casual fan and still say you're a fan. I mean, I would say I'm, kind of a Phillies fan. I live in Philly. Sports teams are like a big thing in Philly. Do I like go to Phillies games? Not very often. That's a really casual fan. That's
Mhm.
on one end of the continuum. Supernatural, where I've been to, I have no idea how many conventions and written 6 books on the show. That's the other end of the continuum. So I
Mhm.
think a lot of people identify as fans, but each person's experience of fandom is different at a different point along that continuum.
And speaking of continuum, when I was kind of putting together my notes for our talk today, I mean, I've heard of fan and I've heard of stalkers, and you had mentioned it earlier on the show, which is like stan. And I was like, well, what the heck is that? And I didn't realize it was stalker and fan put together. And then I was like, oh, that's where the Eminem song comes from. But so what are some healthy boundaries, and like where do people draw the line? When is it unhealthy? Um, when you start to stalk someone,
Yeah, well, obviously, yes, that
right?
that would be under the category of not healthy. That's pretty rare, but you can be any kind of a person and fall into some kind of delusional category. I mean, there are accountants who become delusional and start stalking an ex-partner or something. Like that line is there for all human beings. But I do think there is a line where fandom can push into the pathological. And that's like, if you look at it from a psychological standpoint, the way we decide whether something is diagnosable is whether that thing is interfering with the person's life. If
Mhm.
something is getting in the way of your life and kind of kicking you in the butt, as I tell my students all the time, that's a problem. So if you're passionate about supernatural and you're going to a couple of conventions and that's what you choose to do with your leisure time and how you spend your leisure money, that's fine. If you're passionate about supernatural and you are spending your weekends trying to find Jared Padalecki's house in Austin, that's not fine. If you are a big fan of supernatural and you're spending all of your money to go to conventions or buy posters or whatever it is, and then you can't pay your rent, that's not fine. If you're so obsessed with Dean Winchester like I am, no, but not like this, that you can't keep up your relationships in your real life and you're losing those relationships and it's interfering, that's not fine. So there are boundaries there for all of these things. The vast majority of people are on the healthy side of that boundary, but is it possible to slip into the unhealthy side? Yeah, sure. Have I seen it happen? Yeah, not a lot, but sure.
I've certainly seen that happen where I've been at a convention and someone's like, I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent next month, but I'm glad I'm here. And I'm like, and I'm like, no, 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 like that's not good. But I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not your mother. You have to learn from these choices that you've made. But that one always surprises me because it's something that comes up at the conventions. The topic of money comes up all the time, which I'm
Mhm.
always surprised about because I can tell you I've been to several professional football games, and never once did I hear anybody talking about these seats are so expensive, or those kinds of things. But it's a little bit different of a culture. Um,
But it is the same thing. I mean, you
mhm,
can slide over that same line in sports fandom. It's interesting. When I first started, I study mostly media fandom, but when I started studying media fandom, one of the first things that I wanted to know is this the same as sports fandom? Like, we think of them as very different. Are the mechanisms really different? Are they really pulling for something different? So I had a couple of really interesting conversations with Daniel Wan, who's probably the most well-known psychologist that studies sports fandom. And it really is pretty much the same. So that is also mostly healthy, but can it, if those people aren't talking about, if they're buying season tickets and not paying their rent, or they're following a sports team all over the country and not paying their mortgage, that's the same kind of pathology. It really does slide the same way.
that's really interesting that it would side the same way, but the perception is that they're different, right?
Hmm.
And that for whatever reason,
Well,
being a huge Raiders fan or
I think it's because it's sports. If you're a sports nut, I mean, it's a male dominated thing. So, you see a lot of men that they're sports fans. Typically when you hear a fandom, it's female. So I don't know if like does stereotype or gender play into that?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. In our first 2 books, Phantom at the Crossroads and Fangasm, Supernatural Fangirls, we talk a lot about how, yes, it's absolutely a gendered form of stigma, because even though in reality there are many, many female sports fans, it is still thought of as something that, the guy's going to sit around all Sunday watching the football games. That's totally fine. But If a woman is going to sit around for half of Sunday reading fan fiction or watching episodes of Supernatural, that is not fine. That is frivolous. There's very different expectations for men and for women around what is acceptable to do that is quote unquote selfish, right? Women are very, it was very hard for me when I became a fan. Every time I would spend time on my fandom, felt kind of guilty. My kids were young and like, is it okay for me to do this? It's not traditionally productive. It's not something I'm doing with my partner. It's not something I'm doing with my children. Just doing it by myself and with my friends. Like, is this really okay? And it didn't feel very okay because we're really not socialized to do that. And I
It-
think women struggle a little more than men with allowing themselves to do those things sometimes.
and I really appreciate that you talk about that, because you talk about that in Fangasm in the book, and just feeling that double life of, okay, is this okay? Is this not okay? And so when did you get to the point of accepting that it was okay for you to give yourself this permission?
I would not say that I am 100% there because I still ask myself this sometimes. Um, I feel like I cheated a little bit because I did something with my fandom that is socially acceptable, which is I turned it into a second career. So then it became easy to justify, like, well, this is my research. Yes, I'm watching Supernatural. Yes, I'm reading fan fiction, but I'm writing a book. This is for my research. So I feel a little fraudulent in that was one of my own coping strategies for sort of being okay with this. I go to a lot of conventions. I don't feel bad about that. I'm bringing the books, I'm selling the books, I'm doing research for another book. Would I want to go to those conventions anyway, though? Yes, yes, I would. So I feel like I still, I still struggle with some of that guilt because if I didn't struggle with some of that guilt, I wouldn't be working so hard on my rationalization. And I'm very aware that it's still there.
Well, we appreciate that you do all of this, because you've been able to, well, I think shed light on it, but also normalize it, right? I mean, I think you were one of the first fans that I met that was a professional woman who was doing the same thing I was doing. Like, I'm an attorney here in Las Vegas, and I'm like, sneaking away to go to the convention when it's here at the Rio. And now I'm like, it's on my calendar, it's blocked off. You walk into my office, there's nothing but pictures of me and the guys. And like, I own it, but I feel like I could do that because I started meeting so many professional women like yourself who were also owning it in that space. So I appreciate it, just so you
I
know.
mean, that is why we started to write the books. We really felt like, A, the research that was out there at the time, this is a long time ago, the research that was out there at the time is getting it wrong. B, it's more pathologizing than it should be. And C, it's just not getting it right. The things that they are saying and putting out there as, hey, this is how fans are, especially female fans, that's not what we were experiencing at all. And that's not what we were seeing around us. So we did really want to challenge those stereotypes and get the word out there that, look, this is healthy. This is okay. This is good for people if you're pulled towards this.
So I'm glad that we started off with the stigma of, that kind of surrounds fandom. I had no idea that it was really linked to gender, although I can't really say that I'm too surprised. So I'd like to shift. So what are some of the psychological benefits of belonging to a fandom?
So there's a few different benefits. Some of them are more individual benefits and some of them are more communal kind of benefits. So from an individual perspective, fandom is a very different community and it has very different norms and values than the mainstream community that we're all part of. So thinking in terms of kind of narrative therapy, which I do a lot of, we all sort of define ourselves by writing a life story for ourselves. We tell our own stories in narrative. And oftentimes those narratives are really saturated with like dominant cultural views, which can be misogynistic and homophobic and racist. And there's a lot in the dominant culture that we really wish we didn't absorb into our narratives. Fandom for a lot of people provides an alternative narrative, a place to craft a different life story about your own life because the norms are so different. Within fandom communities, which are oftentimes skewed towards women when you're talking about media fandom, and I'm talking about media fandom now, the norms for self-expression are really very different. And there's also anonymity that people can pull from. And those two things kind of combine to allow people to be a little bit more real in those online communities, which maybe for women especially is very freeing. I'm sure there are circumstances where that's also true for men, but women, because of what we talked about before, we're often not really encouraged to be real. We're not really encouraged to talk about what we're passionate about. We're encouraged to be the object of other people's passions, not the subject of our own passions. Fandom really flips that around. It encourages women to be the subject of their own desires instead of just object of someone else's desires. It gives people a lot of leeway to talk about things that we don't often get to talk about, like sexuality and desire and things like that. I don't mean that fandom is all about sex, but that is part of our identity as women that we don't get to talk about. It's even just freeing in the sense of, I just want to talk about what I want to talk about. I want to be selfish. I want to talk about what I like, and I want somebody to be willing to hear me. I want somebody to see the real me when I am being real. Because when we have a sort of a fake persona on in the rest of the world, even if somebody thinks they're validating us by saying, "Oh yeah, I so agree with you. Oh, like, I love what you said about that," or whatever. If that's not the real us that we're putting out there, that's not validating at all. Inside, we're just saying, "Well, yeah, you like what I said because I was just parroting what I know you want me to say or what the culture wants me to say." Whereas in fandom, I'm saying what I want to say. There's no reason not to. So whether I'm putting it out there in conversation or in tweets or in fan fiction or fan art, I'm putting out something that's real so that when validation comes back, I feel truly validated in that validation. So that self-expression is one of the big individual benefits. The other individual benefit is just identity exploration. We are naturally drawn to look at other people, including fictional people, and sort of try on their attributes to kind of figure out who we are. We instinctively are inspired and motivated by other people. So one of the reasons that we get really passionate about some kind of media is that the story appeals to us and the characters appeal to us. And that can be a really healthy way of exploring who you want to be without going out and doing all those same things. Like, this character really speaks to me. Maybe that's how I want to be. Or this character I really have a strong reaction to. This is exactly what I don't want to be, without having to go out and do all that yourself, because that would be pretty overwhelming. So those are some of the individual benefits.
I love the identity exploration, because one of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm training to be a mindset coach. And one of the things they talk about is allyship. And so they're like, who can you tap into that's an ally that will give you that strength? And for me, I always go to fictional characters. So I've got Sam and Dean are on my board because sometimes I want to be that powerful. I want to be somebody who's going to go in and, take care of business, right? Like, they go in, they clear out the nest, and then they go back to the bunker. Like, that's what happens, right? And so just knowing that that's what that is, it's that identity exploration. Okay, what can I tap into? What are the strengths that they have that I like, that I want to emulate in my life? And I mean, I even did it most recently with Elsa from Frozen. It was like, I wanted to be a stone cold bitch. I was like, I need to do this. I need to be firm. But at the end of the day, she just lets it go, and like, love overwins everything. Right. So it's like, I want to be Elsa. And I just channeled that, and it made such a huge difference. But just knowing that that's part of the benefit of this fandom, and being able to enjoy and relish that, like, that's really cool. I'm really excited about that.
It's really powerful. I mean, that's pretty much the reason why not my most recent book, but the one before that, Family Don't End with Blood. The reason why I was putting that book together is because after I put out the first 3 or 4 books, I just started to hear from so many people about how the books, which felt really good, but also the show and the characters, Supernatural, had like changed people's lives in significant ways, inspired people. People had changed jobs, had the courage to start a new career, gotten out of a cult, conquered cancer. I mean, just like incredible things, channeling, as you say, the motivation of these characters. So I wanted to put that book together to share those inspirational stories so that other people would know this is also a, this is a way that you might be able to do this too. This is a healthy thing that people can latch onto. And then, Jared Padalecki said, well, I've got my own story of how this has, changed my life too. So he contributed, and then all the other actors contributed too, because the show has changed their lives as much as fans' lives, honestly.
It's made a big difference, I think, all around. And even, to like Melissa, right? Like Melissa knows about it. And, when the show announced that it was ending, I had so many people reach out to me being like, hey, we know that the show's ending. Are you going to be okay? It's like, I'll be fine. And then I watched the finale and I was not fine.
No, not fine.
Not fine. But it was just one of those things where the people around us may not get it, but they love me. And so they want, they want me to be okay. And so they also associate Supernatural with me, which I'm like, oh, that's nice. Because now I get this other sense of community of them knowing something about me that if you really know me, you know that I'm a Supernatural fan. Like that's just, if you don't know that about me, we're probably not that very good of friends.
It's part of your identity now, and
Mhm.
it's an important part of your identity. I spent a lot of time around the time of the finale. I put out another book
Mhm.
about the finale. There'll be peace when you are done, because I knew it was going to be so hard for people. But I spent a lot of time kind of validating the grief that people were feeling when the show did go off the air, because I think to someone who hasn't been a fan, it can kind of be dismissed, not by Melissa, but by a lot of people as, come on, it's a TV show. Like, why have you been sobbing for 3 days? It's a TV show. But the show, the characters, and the fandom became really important to many, many people. So losing that's a real loss. It's what we call like a disenfranchised loss, because people don't necessarily recognize it as an important loss, but it is. You're not only losing sort of the existence of those characters that were so motivating to you, but you're also losing that fan community, which has been so important. That community in which you did all that self-expression and were encouraged in exploring your own creativity and made friends all over the world. That's an important benefit of fandom too.
Thank you for touching up on that, because I was just about to ask you, how do fan communities continue after a show is over? I mean, you mentioned it here, and I know I like Golden Girls, and I do like X-Files. You mentioned X-Files. I do remember watching that with my dad. But so I would imagine, though, for people like yourself and Cydia that really identified with the characters or through self-expression, that you're right, that loss of not even just the show being over, but this sense of community. But I imagine that that's going to live long after the show is over.
It will. It definitely will. I think it'll be different. I mean, it does still involve loss, because even though the communities will be there, the online platforms are still there, people will migrate away from many people will start finding other fandoms. I'm pretty fandom monogamous, so I don't know when I'm going to wander away from this show. I think I'm just going to, I watch other shows, but I'm not fanish in that same way. So the community will certainly remain, but it will become a little less, active and vibrant. I think for 15 years, those of us who were in the Supernatural fandom were really spoiled, because there was content every day. Even if there wasn't an episode, we followed all the actors. We knew the people in the crew, the directors, the writers. I mean, it went on for so long that it was a very integrated community. And you could go on your Twitter timeline or your Facebook group or your Tumblr account at any time of the day or night, and there would be fellow fans there talking about something that you wanted to talk about. That's going to get less and less over time. It hasn't really gone down yet, because people are still talking about the finale every day, but eventually it will lessen. I don't think the communities will go away, but they will be different, and there's loss involved with that also.
I had a question from one of our SPN family fans here in Las Vegas, Judy Matheson. She was wondering if people are still affected by the finale and the series coming to an end.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I there's a little online book club that was formed for reading my books, which is very flattering. So I pop into it sometimes, and I popped into it this past week, and they were calling it therapy for the finale. So we were all doing, I was not really acting as a therapist, but we were all kind of trying to do a little therapy for each other in still trying to come to terms with it. And some people, yeah, I loved the finale. I absolutely loved it, which I think has been really helpful to me, that I did love it. I talked to Jensen about this a while ago, about, my feelings on the finale and his feelings on the finale. And we both loved the finale. So I think that helps when it's a loss. Losing Dean was a real loss to him. It was a real loss to me. But
Same.
yeah, understandable. But loving the ending, I think, helped. I have some friends who really didn't like the finale, who found the finale really traumatic for them in a very real kind of way. I mean, not that they, not pathology, not that they're not going to work, not that they're not interacting with their children, but truly found it like very, very upsetting, and are still feeling that way. And some haven't been able to watch it since and don't know when they'll be able to watch it. Other people are just like me, just still really trying to deal with the loss of the show. As much as I liked its arc and I liked where it ended, I'm just sad not to have it. And it's gonna take time. It's only been 6 months. Grief and loss take a long time to adapt to when something is important to us.
And that's really what it feels like, because I'm in your camp. I loved the finale, but it was hard. And I
Mhm.
tried rewatching it, and I managed to get through the rewatch, and I thought I would be okay, but no, I was still crying. And I feel like, I'm going to go back and rewatch it when I feel like I really need a good cry, because it got everything out. And it was something where I even had some friends saying, like, I had to go off of social media because you were sad and we didn't want to see you sad. But part of what I try to do, especially more on my Instagram than anything, is if I'm having a bad day, if I'm doing that stuff, I try to put it out there, because I want to normalize the fact that, hey, my grid's one thing, but hey, maybe I'm dealing with headaches. Maybe I'm sad about my finale. Who knows what it is, right? And so I'm trying to normalize those things. But yeah, no, it was hard. It felt like a real loss. Like I cried when My Chemical Romance announced that they were breaking up, and you know,
Yeah, I mean, these are real losses. One of the things that I've told Jensen and Jared this, Misha too. One of the things I really loved about the finale is it was sort of a master class in grief and loss. So just at the time when the fandom was actually losing the show and grieving, the show itself just had something so powerful to say about loss. It let us really see the pain of that loss. Jared and Jensen just, I don't know why they don't have, Emmys lined up on their shelves. That scene in the barn was just so incredible and so real. And that made it really hard to watch. But, it's important that we get to see other people grieve, that we, like you say, that we get to see people and hear people when they're not at their best, that we don't just see sort of a fake persona of other humans when they're on their Instagram going, hey, everything's fine. I mean, we need to deal with those things. And then, the ending message being so hopeful of, you have to carry on. Sometimes you have to get through these hard times and this grieving and this loss and come out the other side. And then there's reunification and there's happiness, not necessarily in heaven. You have to carry on and find that happiness and keep going. And I thought that was a beautiful message.
I want to come back to something you both had mentioned earlier, which was that, fandom helps meet not only individual but collective needs. So I'd like to ask each of you, what need is most fulfilled as a result of being a member of the fandom community?
Do you want to
well,
go first or do you want me to go first?
you know what? You're our guest. You go first.
I mean, I really actually think that the primary need that's being fulfilled is not something that's specific to fandom. It's a need that's specific to humans and is huge, and that's the need for belongingness. We all have an incredibly intense and powerful need to belong, which, goes back in early times. If you didn't belong to a group, you were literally dead. If you're not in the group, you're eaten by some kind of predator and you disappear. So we have sort of this instinctive terror of not feeling like we belong to a group. It literally feels like you're going to die if you don't belong to a group. But finding a group that you really feel like you can belong in, that you really feel like you can be yourself in and truly be accepted and validated by that group, that's not so easy. And we live in a pretty fragmented society where, you may not have a group that is your coworkers, or you may not have a group that is your neighbors, sort of those time honored historic, in a historic sense. We might not have them anymore. So being able to find a community where you share something with the people in it, but also where you can be real and be validated and be yourself is really powerful. And I think that's what the fandom community really offers.
I totally agree with all of that, especially because from my personal experience, just growing up and always having been a fan, I always felt like I was on the outside. Like all of my friends, were into the rap music and I'm over here listening to boy bands, or, they're into the alternative stuff. And I'm like, no, like, let's listen to pop things, and just always feeling like I never found that. And then when Supernatural came to me, like I was okay the first couple of years and watching it on and off again. But then once I started my professional world, that's when I really started getting more involved in the fandom. And I loved when I first went to the first convention, the person seated next to me, we talked for hours and hours before we even introduced ourselves and before she ever asked me what I did for a living. And I loved that because she was seeing me, we had something in common, and it was all about that belonging that you're talking about. Like I could be my full self here. I could show up, I could dress up if I wanted to, I could be in the costumes, I could geek out over the fact that, how much I love the show, the, fangirling over Dean and Jensen and just all of that. Like I could do all of that in this space, and it was a safe space to do that in.
Yeah.
And, I would go back to my regular life and it's like, oh, okay. And then I start going, okay, when do I get to go to the next convention? When do I get to be around these people again who didn't care about all these other things that I came with? And it's like, okay, it was nice. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. That's part of you. But, we like that you're a fan. We like that you're here. And so those things really appealed to me and continue to appeal to me, because I don't like leading with my titles or education or things like that. I want people to see me. And now they see me as part of the Supernatural fandom. And, my professional people know that. And it's actually allowed meaningful connection with other people who will tell me about the things that they're really into, or the conventions that they've gone to. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, no, we all have something that we like. And I feel the more I'm allowed to be myself and show up fully as myself in other spaces, that allows other people that same opportunity to do the same if that's what they're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right that, most people do have something that they're passionate about. They might not define themselves as a fan, but there's usually something. And I mean, as a psychologist, the thing that sort of worries me most when I'm working with a new client is if I ask the question, what are you passionate about? What do you love? And the answer comes back, nothing. Then internally I'm like, oh no, okay, this is, it's hard to go through life without being passionate about something. That's part of being human, that is really helpful to us in getting us through hard times, in tapping into actual joy, in tapping into, those kind of flow states of creativity. Those things are all tied together. That's good for us. And it's kind of hard for people, and, can be a little bit depressing if you don't have any of that in your life.
Well, I was just talking to Cydia actually before we hopped on the call with you, which is I get envious because I wish that there was something out there that drew me to it, that I could feel passionately about. I know, she has her fandom, my husband has his sports, other people have religion, and everything that I have enjoyed, it's very fleeting. And you're right. It can leave you feeling slightly depressed because when you're looking for inspiration, and how Cydia mentioned earlier, how she taps into various characters to, personify them to help get her through things. I don't have that. So, it can be a struggle for people like myself that, you know, don't get excited about anything.
I mean, it could be all kinds. I have this conversation with my daughter. My daughter is also not Fanish. She is just absolutely not Fanish. And she's still kind of mystified about the fact that I'm Fanish and her brother's Fanish. And, all my friends are Fanish, it seems like. And she just isn't. But that doesn't mean that there are not things that she isn't passionate. I mean, she's a writer. She is passionate about writing. So that's not, she's not a fan of writing. You wouldn't talk about it that way, but she does tap into a lot of passion for that. Some people are passionate about their occupation. Some people are passionate about their children. Some people are passionate about their dog. There's a lot of things you can tap into.
And she does. She's a very proud dog mom over here, and
Aha.
she's an athlete. She
Was
oh, come on,
past tense was.
she's athletic. How about that?
Yeah.
She's
Yeah.
got her things, but I think it's maybe not as well defined as, with me. It's very easy. It's like, oh, okay, what does she not have that's supernatural? Okay, a life-size cutout of Dean and a supernatural mask. Okay, great. Like, it makes it a little bit easier.
It does. It does. Fandom gives you a lot to pull from that you can utilize for all these different purposes that I talked about. It is an easy way to tap into all that stuff.
Oh. Well, I could talk to you about fandom all day long because I think it's really fascinating. And I just like having that validation that it's not something weird. It's not something bad for us. It's actually something good. And if you have this, it's great. And if you don't have it, maybe you can look to see what you are passionate about. You may not define it in the same terms as you're a fan or identify with that word, but you probably have it in your world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said.
So we have 2 questions that we ask all of our guests that we want to make sure that we ask you as well. So looking back, what advice would you give your younger self?
I think I would give my younger self the advice of don't be afraid to be you. Don't be afraid to be yourself and put it out there, because I spent an awful lot of time not being real, not wanting to be me, trying to figure out what persona I should be taking on to be pleasing to, whether it was a teacher or a friend or a romantic partner or a parent or whatever it was, and not really being me. And one of the things that was so wonderful about discovering fandom was finding a community that supported me in being real. It was very terrifying putting out Fangasm is a memoir. Like, it's not even a work of fiction, it's a memoir. It was telling my own story and my friend and co-writer Kathy's own story. That was terrifying, and we had to be talked into it, but it was also tremendously freeing to just put it out there and say, this is me, and you can love it or you can hate it. That's okay, but this is me. So I wish I had known that a lot earlier.
It's good advice. And so looking forward, what is one wish you have for yourself on your current journey?
Ooh. I think my wish on my current journey would be that this has been such a supernatural, and fandom and becoming a writer has been such an unanticipated and surprising journey, and so incredibly fulfilling for me, that now that that show is over and I'm in sort of a transition time and a limbo time, I just hope that something else comes along that is in some way, maybe a completely different way, but in some way is as challenging and eye-opening and world rocking and ultimately fulfilling as this 15-year journey has been.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I wish that for you as well, and for the rest of the fans out there too who are still dealing with the loss.
We want to hear from you. What were some of your takeaways regarding fandom? Share your thoughts with us on Instagram at Pivotal Moments HQ. We want to thank our producer and music director, Ron Johnson. This has been an Astronomicus DMR production. Thank you for listening. Remember, it's never too late and you're right on time.